From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters. Who polices the police? And what happens to officers when they've been accused of a crime? The first question is simple to answer. In Ontario, it's the Special Investigations Unit, also known as the SIU. They're an independent police watchdog that investigates cases of death, serious injury, or alleged sexual assault that involves a police officer. The second question of how police officers are treated in the justice system is much more complicated and often controversial to answer. A paper published by criminal justice researchers in the Canadian Journal of Law and Society tracked SIU charges over 15 years. It found most of the charges against police officers weren't convictions. Instead, they were more often dropped, or it was an acquittal, especially in 2021, a time when the accountability of police is a cultural conversation. What does this data mean? On This Matters, we're talking to Wendy Gillis, the Toronto Star's crime reporter. Wendy dug through the details of this research, interviewing some big players in the criminal justice system. We'll break down the details to figure out whether the rules are different for police in court. Wendy, thanks so much for joining the podcast. It's great to talk to you again.
Thanks so much for having me, Adrian.
Your reporting follows a research project that tracked 15 years worth of data in SIU charges. What did this project look into, and what questions did the researchers want to answer?
Yeah, absolutely. So researchers were looking at Ontario's Special Investigations Unit, which is this really unique kind of investigative agency that only investigates police. So it's police who are involved in a death or a serious injury or allegations of sexual assault. These are typically pretty high-profile investigations. Some of them make a lot of news because, it's associated with a death.
From a bystander's cell phone video of Toronto Police Constable James Versillo firing his Glock service revolver 9 times at Sami Yatim, armed with a knife on an empty streetcar. Versillo's lawyer says that video and the public reaction to it played a big role in today's guilty verdict.
As journalists, we tend to follow them closely, especially when they lead to charges. And, we will typically follow those charges through the court system where possible. But what this research did was actually track kind of on the much larger macro level what happens to cases where the Special Investigations Unit has found that there were grounds for criminal charges to be laid. And that's so beneficial because it gives us kind of a better sense of trends within these kinds of cases. And that's useful because these are really unique cases for the criminal justice system. As I'm sure we'll get into, there's all kinds of factors that make them particularly challenging, not only to investigate, but also to prosecute. And then, if there's a finding of guilt, to lead to sentences.
And in following these charges, these SIU charges, what did the researchers find about how they ended up?
Yeah, so I was really struck by a few of these findings. One of the major takeaways from this was that after the criminal charges are laid, around 30% of the time in the charges that the research looked at, the charge was actually withdrawn before it went to trial and could be heard in court. And that just means that the Crown prosecutor opted to not proceed with the trial. And I'm sure, again, we'll get into this, the reasons for that. But that was surprising to a lot of the criminal justice experts that I spoke to, just because, as I was mentioning, these are investigations that are done by a specialized agency. A lot of resources and time goes into these investigations. There's typically a lot of witnesses, if they exist, are interviewed. And so these are not necessarily typical investigations. So the fact that close to a third of those charges that were laid were withdrawn, that was surprising. Another outcome that was quite common was an acquittal, so that, not guilty. And that, again, is for a number of possible reasons. Certainly, there's a perception, I think, among the public that charges against police officers are maybe a bit trickier or more difficult to prove. And so this gives us a little bit of data to just kind of have that conversation about whether that's true or not.
Right, exactly. So this assumption that many communities have, this data fills in some of those gaps and lets us actually know, okay, and dive into more specifically, is that actually true?
Well, the answer is complicated. I mean, I'm sure it was challenging for the researchers to kind of distill the information that they got. And then it was even more challenging for me, I will admit, as a journalist, to kind of talk a little bit about how to interpret these findings. Because the reality is, it's really challenging to compare these cases to cases in the general public. I think, what we can chat a little bit more definitively about is kind of these comparisons with offenses. And so, in sexual assaults, for example, it was police officers were 15% less likely to be found guilty of sexual assault. And so that's a fairly interesting finding. And then another finding from this research was that when there was a conviction, there were certain charges where it was less likely that the officer would be sent to jail. Although again, with sexual assaults, it was actually more likely that they'd be sent to jail. But sometimes there were offenses where, officers were sentenced less punitively than the general public. So certainly there are differences.
Right. Yeah. I noticed that in the reporting of this data, they also looked more specifically into what kinds of offenses police officers are most often charged with. And it mentions both assault and sexual assault. Those are the top two.
Yeah. And I have to say, I've been covering these issues for a long time. I don't know that I would have assigned the order in the way that they did. So yes, assault was the most common, and then sexual assault was the second most common. And that's the one that I was kind of struck by. Following that, the third most common was driving related, and then breach of trust. Breach of trust is often a charge that's laid in conjunction with other charges. So that wasn't necessarily as surprising. But, assault being number one makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of allegations that police officers may cross the line when they're doing something like, affecting an arrest. And again, those are offenses that are challenging to prove, in the absence of something like video evidence or an independent witness. Same thing with sexual assault. It can be really challenging to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a police officer or anyone who's charged with sexual assault is guilty, because typically these are cases that involve kind of a he said, she said, and it comes down to credibility.
So to recap, the numbers appear to show that police officers of a fairly large sample size of 15 years, 150 some odd charges, often have their cases withdrawn or have an acquittal rather than a conviction. And I think the biggest question here is why, right? And you interviewed criminologists, you interviewed lawyers, SIU directors, and they all have a different piece to the puzzle of this question. Why do they think the numbers are what they are?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. And, I feel like I'm a little bit of a criminal justice nerd. And so forgive me if I go a bit too into detail here. But I mean, there's so many factors. On the one hand, there are the supports that police officers typically enjoy, and that's something that the research goes into in terms of these are individuals who are charged who typically have support of a police union to help them kind of go through this process. They typically have access to really highly specialized lawyers. And, on the other side of that, I will say that the Crown prosecutors who are assigned to these cases are also typically pretty experienced and specialized crowns when it comes to these kinds of cases. But it's important to talk about, defense lawyers, because not every person who is criminally charged has access to someone who is really highly specialized, can have a lot of time to devote to their cases. There's this other sort of phenomenon that I think is important to talk about, which is the distinction between, what the SIU has to prove when they lay charges against an officer versus what a Crown prosecutor is looking at. And when I talk about that, I'm talking about the threshold that has to be met when it comes to charges. So when the Special Investigations Unit is investigating and considering laying charges, the threshold they have to meet is reasonable grounds that a charge has been laid. When the Crown prosecutor receives a file for, an officer that's been charged criminally, what they have to meet, the threshold that they have to meet, is reasonable prospect of conviction and that the case is in the public interest. I think, the public interest, we can talk about whether or not that's always present in cases where a police officer is charged. I think that that's probably an easier bar to meet, frankly. But whether there's a reasonable prospect of conviction, that's important to talk about because, we're discussing criminal justice issues. We're talking about public cases and, a court system that's often bogged down. You don't want to bring to trial offenses that don't have a likelihood of convictions. And so they make that decision by looking at the evidence in that, hypothetical folder, right? So does that mean, is there forensic evidence? Is there video evidence? Is there an independent witness who can corroborate, the account of a complainant or the police officer? And what the researchers found is that that wasn't always the case. In fact, that was more rarely the case. And that in a lot of these cases, it really is about, a credibility battle between what the police officer says and what an alleged victim is purporting happened. So that's another really important aspect here, because as we know, police officers tend to get the benefit of the doubt from juries and from judges.
We'll be right back. There are clearly several factors here at work that police officers perhaps have in their favor, whether it's benefit of the doubt, whether it is a higher bar that needs to be met with SIU cases, support by police unions too, that perhaps the regular citizen that they don't necessarily have access to?
Yeah, I think that's very fair to say. There's also another factor that I think is important just mentioning, is that the context out of which charges against police officers arise can be really complicated, right? There's a difference between an assault charge that's laid against someone, associated with a bar brawl. There's a totally different context when you're talking about an assault charge that's laid against a police officer in the context of an arrest, right? This is a police officer who, in the course of doing their work, was charged with assaulting someone. And that's a really complicated situation for a judge to kind of contemplate. This is someone who was doing their job. In my piece, I get into some of the specific numbers, but, frequently the alleged victim in these cases is someone who is described as being, in the course of a crime, being involved in a crime and resisting arrest. So someone who may be fighting back or alleged to have been fighting back is an important distinction to make. And so again, it gets back to the credibility when a judge is looking at who do I believe, someone who is alleged to have been in the course of a crime and resisting arrest versus a police officer.
Right. In a lot of these cases, officers were obviously called to the scene for a reason or got a call for help or service that, in our daily lives, it's a different situation, as officers would undoubtedly tell you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. That's another reason why they're just so complicated. And yet it's so important, right? There are cases, and I wrote about one, a couple weeks ago, where there was a conviction against a police officer in Toronto for assault. And in that case, there was video evidence that showed him walking up to someone who had just been arrested and was on the ground with handcuffs on and kicking them. And so, I quoted a lawyer talking about how in the absence of that video, it is really difficult to contemplate what happened there. And would a judge have come to the same conclusion as he did in this case, which was, to convict an officer and actually send them to jail, which is another pretty rare sentence, without that video. So yeah, these are just so complicated.
Right. There was something else I wanted to touch on too, and we've talked about it on this podcast, about the role of the SIU and how police officers have to interact with them or don't have to interact with them, really, in that, like any Canadian citizen, they don't have to be compelled to give a statement in this case. How does that all factor into, again, some of the public trust that people have in the SIU?
Such a good question, Adrian. This is another complex issue involved here. I sound like a broken record.
It's all really tough, yeah.
But I have been kind of writing about this issue periodically, within the last 5 years, just sort of because across the spectrum of kind of criminal justice experts, there's such a wide disparity, even amongst SIU directors. One of them that I interviewed for this piece feels really strongly that police officers should be compelled to give their notes and to be subjected to interviews. And another one feels like, why should police officers be any different than a Canadian citizen who does have that right against self-incrimination under the Charter? The reason it can be complicated is because one of the lawyers I talked to said, we give police officers a gun, we give them these special powers, and so we really should be expecting them to provide a full account of what happened, particularly in these cases where it leads to someone's death, right? I think as a member of the public, especially, family members or friends of someone who was killed in a police interaction, I can understand how it might be challenging to wrap your head around why, the police officer that pulled the trigger might not have to tell SIU investigators what happened. I have been told by the current director of the SIU that usually they are able to determine what happened in cases without speaking to the officer. But again, that might be a hard pill to swallow if you are related to a person who died. So in terms of how that might impact, the outcome of SIU investigations, it may mean that, for example, a charge might be laid in the absence of the subject officer. So that means the officer who is the focal point of that investigation and who may end up charged. It might mean that a charge is laid against them and then they get a defense lawyer, they prepare a statement and give their account for the first time. And that could change things. It could mean that the Crown looks at the case now and thinks, okay, I'm not sure if there are reasonable grounds to proceed anymore. Or it's clear that a crime wasn't committed here. So it can certainly affect the impact of these investigations, to not hear directly from the officer who is charged.
Yeah, it seems to be getting at this conversation that certainly the public is having right now, but also within the ecosystem of the criminal justice system. Courts, police, the people who investigate them, and lawyers, they're asking that question too of whether or not police officers should be held to a higher standard. If they are applying a different threshold in court cases, should they also be held to a higher standard in terms of their conduct too?
Yeah, and I think you'll find that is a sentencing consideration for judges, and that was a finding in this research too, that in cases where there was a conviction, sometimes there were examples of police officers who were not sentenced as punitively. And that might have to do, as we were talking before, about, the context of this offense and that it happened in the line of duty. On the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, there is this expectation that because of their experience, because of their familiarity with the criminal justice system, and because of the position of trust that police officers have in our society, the expectation is higher and therefore the sentence should actually be more punitive. And so that was seen in some cases where there was a conviction of sexual assault, where it was actually more likely that a police officer would be sentenced to jail time than compared to the general public. And typically with these cases, there is sometimes an additional charge that's laid, which is breach of trust. And that's what I was talking about before in terms of, that's another criminal charge that's laid when it's perceived that a person in position has abused their power in some way.
We live in an era where there are widespread conversations about police reform and oversight of police. You've certainly talked about it multiple times on this podcast. And, I asked this question sort of earlier in the conversation too, and I'll bring it back in terms of what we can learn from this data, because especially in some racialized communities, marginalized communities, there is that widespread belief that police officers, at the very least, are treated differently in the criminal justice system compared to so-called regular people like you and I. In matters of public confidence, what should people maybe take away from this data that they see about what the legal consequences are for officers?
That is such a good question. I think this is amazing data in a lot of ways. I mean, this is so helpful for me as a journalist. I think it's so helpful to the general public to just have a broader understanding of how these cases tend to play out in the criminal justice system. One unfortunate aspect that, isn't the fault of the researchers, but is actually just the fault of kind of the system more broadly, is that there isn't race-based data that they were able to mine to get a better sense of how these cases may or may not be impacted by race. And so I think it's challenging to not have that piece of the puzzle, because so much of the broader conversation that's happening now around police reform and defunding has to do with disparities in treatment of, Black and Indigenous people of color. And so what I hope is that this type of research continues and that we can have an element of race that's brought in to really examine the role that race may or may not play in these types of cases. We do know from other research that's been done, more recently by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, looking at kind of cases where force was used by Toronto police, that Black people were disproportionately impacted by police use of force. And so that's one piece of the puzzle here. And I think we just need to keep examining this issue, because that will help inform these really crucial conversations that are happening, even more.
Right. As good as this data is, and as thorough as it is, there are still some really key pieces that are missing in how we actually understand this conversation, and backed up by information and data.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is, I think, what's so great about having this information, is that it allows us to get a broader sense of, as I said, the outcomes of these cases. And, then we can have more informed conversations about a really crucial issue that, I'm glad we're still talking about, which is, police oversight debate and conversations around policing that need to keep happening.
Wendy, thank you as always for your reporting. As we mentioned multiple times in this conversation, it's really complex, really complicated stuff. So thank you for helping break it down.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
And that is Wendy Gillis, the Toronto Star's crime reporter. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Chung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Muthar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.